Hello everybody, this is Cabane the Christian, and I'm presenting a positive case for the authorship and date of Matthew. I'm reading from a script, so if it looks like I'm reading from something, I am. A script that I wrote, because this video isn't really one you can do. You can't wing it. Let's begin. In this video, I will be defending the authorship of Matthew, and an early date for Matthew. I believe Matthew was authored by Matthew in Antioch in 50 to 60, probably closer to 60. We begin with date. I've already responded to Kikai's point, so I can move to some positive evidence. Indications that the Jerusalem temple is still standing are found in Matthew 12:5-7. Quote, "Or you have not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here, and if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." Matthew 23:15-23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools! For which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing, but if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men! For which is greater, the gift on the altar that makes the gift sacred, or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it, and whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." And finally, Matthew 26:60-61. "But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, 'This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" Unquote. After 70 Common Era, the temple tax went to support the pagan temple of Jupiter, so it is unlikely that the story of the fish and the coin would have been included here in Matthew chapter 17, verses 24-27. Finally, we can note the mention of the Sadducees. Matthew has more warnings about the Sadducees than the rest of the New Testament combined. The Sadducees were wiped out with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, so it would be useless for the author to include these warnings had the date of composition been later than 70 Common Era. Now for location. Kikai has already presented a good case that this gospel was written in Antioch, and I have no problems with that. Finally, authorship. Let us look first at the external evidence, which Kikai glosses over completely. Before we look at this, a comment must be made. The title of Matthew must have been added early, and people must have associated the Gospel with Matthew early, because if not, then people would have a different title to the work, as both Karsten Thied in Eyewitness to Jesus, page 15, and Martin Hengel in Studies in the Gospel of Mark, page 82, note. Papias says in 125 Common Era, Matthew made an arrangement of the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each translated them as he was able. This may be referring to an early Aramaic Proto-Matthew, which Matthew later translated into Greek. Irenaeus confirms Matthean authorship in about 180 Common Era. We also have the book titles confirming Matthean authorship. No other author is identified in any manuscript of Matthew, as Dr. Wallace notes. Let us compare this with secular works, such as the Annals of Tacitus. Going with my date of 55, Matthew is identified as the author of Matthew 55 to 75 years after his Gospel was composed. Going with Kikai's date of 85, we have this Gospel identified as being authored by Matthew 25 to 45 years of composition. With the Annals of Tacitus, the first definite description of it to Tacitus comes from Tertullian, quoting it 100 years after its composition. So the external evidence from Matthew is stronger for Matthean authorship of Matthew than the external evidence for Tacitian authorship is for the Annals. Next, internal evidence. We have quite a wealth of internal evidence for the authorship of Matthew. The story of the fish and the coin would have interested Matthew as a tax collector. As noted by Kikai, the style of Matthew is systematic. Contrary to Kikai, this actually indicates Matthean authorship, as Matthew would have been particularly systematic as a tax collector. When referring to his house, the author of Matthew refers to it as the house rather than his house. So Matthew is actually writing in a writing sort of kind of in first person here. Also worthy of note is the technical monetary term found in Matthew 22:15-22, as compared to the standard term used in the parallel passages used in Mark 12:13-17 and Luke 20:20-26, as Edmund Hybert notes on page 60 of the Introduction to the New Testament. Wallace also notes that Matthew uses monetary terms such as debts in 6:12, where the Lucan parallel has sins. Matthew uses bankers in 25:27, drachma in 17:24, and stater in 17:25, and talent in 18:24-25. Matthew, as a tax collector, would be a Hellenized Jew, and it shows. Matthew writes in Greek literary style, far from disconfirming Matthean authorship, as Kakai argues, and actually confirms it. To conclude, the Gospel of Matthew was written before 70, probably around 55 to 60, in Antioch, by the Apostle Matthew.